In 1987, Monroe County, Alabama, Walter Johnny D. McMillian, a black man running a small pulpwood business, was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murder of an 18-year-old girl named Rhonda Morrison. Despite a lack of real evidence and the entire case being built on false accusations, he was thrown into death row, awaiting execution.
McMillian was convicted by a jury who recommended a life sentence. But today, Judge Robert E. Lee Key overrode their decision and sentenced McMillian to death.
The story then shifts to Bryan Stevenson, a young and ambitious law student at Harvard who travels to a local jail in Jackson, Georgia, as part of his internship at the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. There, he meets Henry, a death row inmate who has been living with the fear of execution looming over him. Bryan informs Henry that the organization he works for has taken up his case and will soon assign him a lawyer. He reassures Henry that his execution will not happen within the next year, giving him some time. Upon hearing this, Henry, who had been struggling with the uncertainty of his fate, finally feels a sense of relief. The two begin talking, sharing stories in their childhood, and even laughing together for a moment. However, this brief moment of warmth is soon interrupted when a prison guard arrives and forcefully takes Henry away. The officer's rough and humiliating treatment of Henry shocks Bryan, leaving him with a deeper understanding of the cruelty these men face every day. 2 years later, Bryan graduates from Harvard and, instead of accepting lucrative job offers, decides to dedicate his career to fighting for justice. His goal is to help those who have been wrongfully convicted or lack the financial means to afford proper legal defense. With this mission in mind, he moves to Alabama, where he joins forces with Eva Ansley, a passionate woman who shares his determination to help death row inmates. Together, they plan to establish a legal service focused on representing those sentenced to death. However, their journey begins with a major setback. They find an office space to rent, but the landlord, upon learning they intend to defend death row prisoners, refuses to lease it to them. The rejection frustrates Eva, but she refuses to give up. She decides that, until they find a proper office, they will run their operations from her home. That night, while discussing their motivations, Eva shares a personal reason that led her to this work. She had once heard the story of a man on death row, and it deeply affected her. The more she learned about wrongful convictions, the more she felt the need to take action. She was on the verge of giving up when she received a call from a Harvard lawyer offering federal funding to start a legal center dedicated to these cases. Without hesitation, she agreed, knowing it was her chance to make a real difference. Determined to begin his work as soon as possible, Bryan heads to a prison to meet with 6 inmates. However, he is caught off guard when the guards insist that he strip before being allowed entry. Confused, Bryan protests, stating that lawyers are not subjected to strip searches during legal visits. But the officer refuses to let him in unless he complies. Left with no choice, Bryan reluctantly follows their orders, enduring humiliation before finally being granted access to his clients.
Bend over and spread.
Once inside, he speaks with the prisoners, who open up about the injustice they have faced. They describe how judges and attorneys have treated them unfairly, ignoring crucial details that could have changed the outcome of their cases. One inmate, Herbert Richardson, shares his story with Bryan, a Vietnam War veteran. Herbert struggles with PTSD, a condition that led him to make poor decisions. He admits to placing a bomb on someone's porch, but insists he never meant to harm anyone. Meanwhile, Bryan meets Johnny D., who has already lost all hope. Years of failed attempts to prove his innocence have left him bitter and unwilling to trust another lawyer. To him, Bryan is just another outsider who will eventually realize the system is too powerful and give up, just like everyone else. Johnny D. warns Bryan that the people in power won't let him succeed. He tells Bryan that the system doesn't care about innocence, and once a black man is accused, the truth no longer matters. He speaks from experience, explaining how he was convicted without any real evidence, no fingerprints, no forensic proof, just a made-up testimony from a man who had his own reasons for lying. Johnny D. is convinced that Bryan will fail just like every lawyer before him, and he walks away, unwilling to get his hopes up again. Back in their cells, Herbert expresses his appreciation for Bryan's kindness, but Johnny D. and another inmate, Ray, see things differently. They believe that being nice won't help anyone here. It won't stop the system from crushing them. Determined to prove Johnny D.'s innocence, Bryan spends the night going through case files. The next morning, he shares his findings with Eva. His research reveals shocking details. The prosecution's key witness, Ralph Myers, has spent most of his life in and out of prison and was convicted in an entirely different murder case. Another witness, Bill Hooks, testified that Johnny D's truck was at the crime scene, but his statement was highly questionable. Bryan and Eva come to a disturbing realization. Myers likely approached the police, who had been struggling to solve the case for over a year, and offered a false confession in exchange for a lighter sentence. With this new information, Bryan decides to confront District Attorney Tommy Chapman. Since Chapman was once a public defender, Bryan hopes he might be open to listening to reason. The next day, Bryan visits him and lays out his concerns about Johnny D's conviction, pointing out how unreliable the evidence against him is. But Chapman dismisses his arguments without hesitation. He insists that Johnny D caused immense pain to the people of Monroe County and warns Bryan that reopening the case will only reopen old wounds, ones that many people would rather leave buried. Bryan firmly tells Chapman that his role as an attorney isn't to make people feel comfortable, it's to ensure justice is served. His job is to uncover the truth, not protect the emotions of those unwilling to face it. Chapman, unimpressed, remains unwilling to cooperate. As Bryan leaves the office, he notices 3 black men being aggressively handcuffed and taken into custody. The sight only strengthens his resolve to fight for those who have been wrongfully accused. Determined to gather more evidence, Bryan travels to Johnny D's home, where he meets his wife, Minnie, and other family members. They assure him that Johnny D could never have committed such a crime. More importantly, they explain that he had a solid alibi. On the morning of the murder, Johnny D was hosting a fish fry with his family to raise money for their church. The event was well attended, and several people saw him working on his truck with his son, John, during the exact time the crime took place. As the conversation continues, one family member brings up an issue that may have played a role in Johnny D's arrest. They reveal that Johnny D had an affair with a white woman. When her husband found out, he spread the news throughout the town. Rumors about Johnny D escalated quickly, from being labeled a cheater to being falsely accused of drug dealing. Eventually, the gossip turned into something even worse. People began seeing him as a criminal capable of murder. Minnie admits that she was deeply hurt by her husband's infidelity, but no matter what mistakes he made, she knows he isn't a murderer. She is determined to stand by him for the sake of their children. Before heading home, Bryan speaks with Darnell, a close friend of Johnny D's son, who provides a crucial piece of information. He reveals that Bill Hooks, one of the prosecution's key witnesses, lied under oath. According to Darnell, Bill was with him that morning, fixing a Camaro's head gasket. However, after they were arrested for burglary, Bill was offered a deal. If he testified against Johnny D, the charges against him will be dropped. Initially hesitant to get involved, Darnell eventually agrees to sign a statement supporting the truth, which could be a significant step toward reopening Johnny D's case. The next day, Bryan visits Johnny D again. This time, Johnny D seems different. He has already heard about Bryan's visit to his family and is impressed by how much effort Bryan is putting into the case. However, he still doesn't understand why a Harvard-educated lawyer would dedicate himself to defending death row inmates. In response, Bryan shares a personal story. He recalls how his grandfather was murdered over something as trivial as a black and white television, and no one outside their community cared. That experience made him realize how easy it is for people like Johnny D to be ignored, silenced, and forgotten. That's why he does his work, to stand up for those who have been pushed into the shadows. Hearing Bryan's words, Johnny D finally agrees to let him take on his case. Meanwhile, another urgent matter arises. Herbert Richardson's execution date is officially set. As Bryan and Eva discuss what can be done for him, Eva receives a terrifying threat. A phone call warns her that if she continues working with Johnny D's legal team, her house will be bombed. Though shaken, she refuses to back down. She and Bryan both understand that this fight will not be easy, but they are determined to push forward. Their next step is to find someone in town willing to talk about the case. However, no one wants to publicly challenge the victim's family or the authorities. Eventually, a former police officer allows Bryan into his home for a conversation. Around the same time, Bryan and Eva secure a proper office space and officially establish their organization, the Equal Justice Initiative. Just as things seem to be moving in the right direction, Darnell is arrested while working his shift. Later, Bryan learns that Darnell has decided to withdraw his statement, fearing for his safety. He asks Bryan to tell Johnny D that he's sorry, but that he can't risk being involved anymore. Frustrated, Bryan realizes that the authorities are trying to intimidate anyone who might support Johnny D's case. When Bryan goes to confront Sheriff Tate, he finds District Attorney Chapman sitting beside him, laughing as if he had been expecting Bryan's visit. It quickly becomes clear that the two men have already conspired against him. Chapman coldly informs Bryan that his motion to reopen the case has been denied. Furious but not defeated, Bryan returns to the prison and discusses the situation with Johnny D. With Darnell no longer an option, they decide to go straight to the key witness, Ralph Myers. If there's any chance of unraveling the case, they need to hear directly from him. Bryan approaches Myers in the prison cafeteria, attempting to get him to open up. At first, Myers refuses to talk about Johnny D at all, but Bryan carefully steers the conversation toward the testimony. Myers eventually reveals that he was first questioned about Rhonda Morrison's murder on the very day he was arrested. What disturbs Bryan the most is what Myers says next. After murder, people in the town were desperate for answers. The need for a suspect was so overwhelming that the truth no longer mattered. All that mattered was closing the case. When people care this much about something, Myers says, they'll do anything to get what they want. With that, he walks away. This statement makes Bryan suspicious. According to the official court records, Myers' testimony against Johnny D was recorded in August, but if he had already been questioned in June, then something isn't adding up. Bryan and Eva realize that the police may have hidden an earlier statement, one that could contradict the testimony used in court. Determined to uncover the truth, Bryan travels to Escambia Courthouse and digs through Myers' case files. There, he finds a critical piece of evidence, a recorded statement from Myers dated June 3rd. In it, Myers tells Sheriff Tate that he has no knowledge of Rhonda Morrison's murder and refuses to frame an innocent man. Eva listens in shock as Bryan plays the recording. Everything Johnny D has been saying from the very beginning was true. The case against him was a complete fabrication. But while they may have found a major breakthrough, another heartbreaking event looms ahead. Herbert's execution is scheduled for the next day. As the prison prepares for his final hours, Johnny D tries to comfort him, telling him to hold on to hope until the very last moment. He believes in Bryan in the fight for justice, even if the system refuses to see the truth. The next morning, Bryan receives a devastating call. The court has denied his motion to delay Herbert's execution. Time has run out. Soon after, Herbert is put to death by electrocution in Alabama, as ordered by the jury.
You look fine.
Have any final words you'd like to say?
The reality of it shakes Bryan to his core, but even in his grief, he refuses to back down. He knows there are still others on death row who need him, and he cannot afford to lose hope. Determined to strengthen Johnny D's case, Bryan meets with Ralph Myers again. This time, Myers finally admits the truth. He was tortured and threatened with a death penalty unless he agreed to testify against Johnny D. The pressure was unbearable, and he was left with no choice but to say what they wanted to hear. Bryan urges him to share this truth in court, knowing it could be the breakthrough they need. During the hearing, Myers initially seems uncertain and hesitant in his answers. However, as the questioning continues, he finally confesses. His testimony against Johnny D was a complete lie, forced upon him under duress. Bryan's case grows even stronger when Myers' doctor testifies that he suffered lasting mental trauma after being subjected to an electric shock by the state. More evidence follows when a former police officer, whom Bryan had previously spoken to, takes a stand. He contradicts Myers' original testimony, stating that Rhonda Morrison's body was actually found face down, not face up, as Myers had claimed. He further reveals that when he refused to provide false testimony to support the prosecution's case, he was fired from his job. Despite these powerful revelations, a month passes, and the court refuses to grant Johnny D a new trial. The judge rules that there isn't enough concrete proof that Myers was lying during his initial testimony. As a result, Johnny D is ordered to return to Holman Correctional Facility, where his death sentence remains in place. Bryan is devastated, feeling as though he has let Johnny D and his family down. However, Johnny D remains resilient. In prison, he thanks Bryan for giving him and his family the one thing no one else could, the truth. He may still be behind bars, but at least now, the world knows he was wrongfully accused. No one can take that away from him. But Bryan isn't ready to give up. He immediately begins preparing a motion to submit their evidence to the Alabama Supreme Court in Montgomery, which has the authority to overturn the circuit court's ruling and force them to grant a new trial. To gain public support, he also makes a powerful 16-minute public address, rallying people behind the fight for justice. When Bryan files the appeal, the Supreme Court reviews the case and makes a landmark decision. It overturns the circuit court's ruling and grants Johnny D a new trial. However, just as things seem to be turning in their favor, District Attorney Tommy Chapman steps in, requesting the court to halt the proceedings. Determined to change his mind, Bryan goes directly to Chapman's home and urges him to reconsider. However, Chapman refuses to listen and furiously orders Bryan to leave. On the day of the motion hearing, Bryan presents a compelling argument before the judge, making it clear that Johnny D has been wrongfully imprisoned for years without a shred of real evidence. In a surprising turn of events, Chapman finally relents and decides to support Bryan's motion. With his backing, the court drops all charges against Johnny D, and he is finally reunited with his family after spending years on death row for a crime he didn't commit.
All charges against you are dismissed.
In the epilogue, it is revealed that Bryan Stevenson and his legal team went on to win relief, reversals, and releases for over 140 prisoners who have been sentenced to death. Bryan remained close friends with Johnny D until his passing in 2013 due to early onset dementia. Another notable case was that of Anthony Ray Hinton, a former death row inmate who spent 28 years behind bars before Bryan successfully proved his innocence, leading to his release in 2015.